Welcome everyone to lecture number 5, the first of our listening skills lectures, and I really want to encourage you to prepare actually for this lecture by reading this paper that's up on ARC for this week. Shared Wisdom is the name of the book, The Use of the Self in Pastoral Care and Counselling by Pamela Cooper-White. It's really, really important that you have a good grasp of this before you watch or listen to this lecture. So if you haven't read it, push pause now and go and read that. Make yourself a cuppa, sit down in a quiet corner and read that. And I've encouraged you to read it slowly and underline it and make notes from it and read it more than once. And for that reason, I've given you only this reading this week. There aren't any other readings because I want you to have a really good grasp on what Pamela Cooper-White is sharing with us this week, because it'll just give us that level of insight into human knowing and the way we understand one another and the way we construct meaning in the world. That forms the basis of our consideration of listening skills today. And what we're the three primary listening skills that we're going to be working on today I've just decided arbitrarily to call them this, and we'll unpack what these designations mean over the next little while. But firstly, paying attention to oneself. Yes, this is a listening skill, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But so number one, paying attention to oneself is a basic listening skill that will underlie all of the other skills that you begin to develop as you train yourself in the art of pastoral and spiritual care. Secondly, I've named this second one the skill of maintaining a stance of common humanity. And this is to do with protecting the dignity of those whom we care for, and in the protection of their dignity, protecting our own dignity. And we'll talk a bit more about that. The third listening skill that we're going to deal with today, I've called the skill of proximity. And this is to do with being able to maintain attention to the reality of the situation and the reality of the person that we're caring for, and indeed our own reality, as opposed to trying to pretend that what is real isn't happening somehow, or trying to comfort myself and the other with a narrative or a story or an understanding, an ideology of the world that is more comforting if I think that way, but in fact doesn't reflect the reality. And proximity, this idea of proximity, comes to us through the work of Simone Weil, who we're going to be looking at in particular today, who believed very firmly that if she was going to write and speak about any human situation, she needed to gain as close to a full understanding of that situation as she possibly could if she was going to say anything about it. And for us, I think we can learn from that, that if in fact we are going to commit ourselves to caring for other people, particularly from a perspective of meaning and relationship and the quest for the beyond, something beyond our immediate experience, transcendence, God, then we need to actually be able to open ourselves up to their reality, to what is actually real about their situation and their experience, their questions, their wonderings, their doubts, their hopes and desires, and the things that determine the way they behave from day to day. So, paying attention to oneself, maintaining a stance of common humanity, and working from a place of proximity to what is real. They're the basics, the basic listening skills that we're going to talk about together today. And yes, these are very, very formative skills. They're not as it were, the pointy end of the skill scale. They might not be mechanisms of healing or therapeutic processes in a sense, but they're the skills that form the foundation of the way we work with all of those other skills that unfold at the coalface. So why don't we get into this? I hope you're prepared. Of course, the great thing about this format is that you can pause it at any time, and you can replay it, of course, bits and pieces of it. I'm recording it audio as well, so if you want to listen to it in the car or while you're out for a run or any of those ways of engaging, then you can do that. So don't feel like you just need to sit down and digest all of this in one hit. You can take it in 5-minute bites and think it through and formulate your own questions and so on. We're going to be meeting, of course, on Thursday at 11:30 for our tutorial, and I'm expecting that you will have done the reading, that you will have watched or listened to this lecture, and that you will have, hopefully, if you feel able to, watched the film An Encounter with Simone Weil. As you will see, that is not a compulsory activity. The film does contain some scenes of the victims of war that can be quite confronting for some of us. The film also deals very strongly with themes of suicide and suicidal ideation and human suffering. And for some of us, these themes may well be cause for disturbance or may trigger emotions, feelings and experiences that we weren't previously aware of. So just be cautious. If you're a bit concerned, then I would advise that you find yourself a support person, someone whom you trust, that you know will be able to care for you and help you process some of the things that might be raised for you during the watching of that film. If it is of serious concern for you, then please just don't watch the film. There will be enough content here in the lecture for you to engage with in the conversation on Thursday. But barring all of that, if you feel like you would like to watch the film and engage in the material at that depth, then I encourage you to do so. I think it will be a really important formative experience for you. All right, so beginning the process of identifying and developing the skills required for deep listening to another person, relies on the awareness of the foundational elements that we identified in last week's lecture. The main foundational element that we identified, that we spent most of our time elucidating in the last lecture, was what Neil Pembroke calls availability, in the sense that the vocation of the pastoral and spiritual carer and listener is to foster in themselves the foundation of inner availability to the other person. So, and I think this is a really important notion that we need to constantly remind ourselves of, but also to keep questioning and critically assessing in the sense that we are in the way that we understand it, so that we have a good, robust understanding of it and not an understanding that could actually make things harder for us. So the notion of availability to the other must be clear to us if we're to make it our foundation for the art of listening. And I think largely Pembroke's approach to it is good and robust. But today I want to use, I think, one of the limitations of his approach, or the weaknesses of his approach, to help us unpack a really, really important clarification of the idea of being available, fully available to the other person as we listen and pay attention to them. Because there are some inherent risks, and one of those risks I think Pembroke doesn't deal particularly well with, which gives us the opportunity to dive in at that point in the conversation and ask ourselves, well, if he doesn't deal particularly well with it, what does it look like? What does it look like to do that well? So let's have a go at that. I think the limitation in Pembroke's idea of availability is his notion of substitution that we came across when we looked at the case study of Edith caring for the partner of a person who had recently died from AIDS, if you remember that one. Pembroke's ideas of availability as the attitude of substitution caused me some concern, because he appears to suggest that one should be prepared to, and he actually writes this, substitute the needs of the other for one's own desires. This idea of substitution is, I think you will be aware already, deeply embedded in some forms of Christian theology, and calls to mind the invitation to lay down one's life for one's friends. And Pembroke makes this explicit when he writes, and I quote, "Substitution is grounded in the radical openness associated with the Abrahamic covenant. To say to someone, 'I belong to you,' means," says Marcel, the philosopher, Christian philosopher Marcel, I am opening an unlimited credit account in your name. You can do what you want with me. I give myself to you." That's the stance, the attitude. It is precisely this deep generosity, says Pembroke, generosity of spirit, and this openness in the relationship which constitute the essential nature of pastoral care. Now, I have some concerns about this, and here they are. Can one truly be available, however, if one has effectively given oneself up or laid down one's own life for the other? The idea being that my desires, my concerns, myself, the emotions and feelings that I'm having can be somehow set aside or muted or made to be quiet or go away in favour of the other person. Is that possible? And is it advisable? Am I really listening to the other if I am labouring under the impression that I must sacrifice myself in pursuit of the other person's healing? Does the other person actually need me or want me to do that for them? And does such auto-subjugation of my inner life for the sake of the other actually do any good? So these are some of the assumptions, particularly within Christian theology, would suggest that yes, these things do good. This is actually the nature of what it means to be a loving human person, and particularly a Christian person. I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure that that's what the Christian way of living that we witness in the story of Jesus of Nazareth actually invites us to. So the answer to these questions that I've just asked, I contend, is no in every case. No, one cannot be truly available if one has effectively given oneself up or laid one's life down for the other. No, I am not really listening to the other if I am labouring under the impression that I must sacrifice myself in pursuit of their healing. No, the other person usually doesn't actually need or want me to do that for them. And no, subjugating my own inner life for the sake of the other generally doesn't do any good. In fact, it runs the risk of doing great harm. So no, and now I'm going to defend my no to those things, and I hope you're thinking through your own response to those questions and writing down your no's and your yeses and your questions to bring to our conversation later in the week. I contend my no on the basis of the phenomenological unearthing of the intersubjective basis of all relations. And now this would be a great time for you to stop, if you haven't already done so, and read Pamela Cooper-White's article, because some of the language of phenomenology and of intersubjective relations is really well explained and worked out for you in that article. So I'm going to proceed on the basis and the understanding that you have read that article, and if you're finding it hard to follow, then I point you back to the article. So the phenomenology of intersubjectivity asserts that in every human encounter there are two subjects in all their inherent dignity that must be present to one another in the full awareness and understanding of themselves as present to the other. So you can hear already that any real, meaningful human encounter will have at least two subjects who are aware of themselves as participants in an encounter with an other who is also participating on the basis of their selfness, their subjectivity. So the implication of this phenomenological observation is that if I set myself aside in order to care for the other, I am no longer authentically present, no longer present in a healthy manner based on my understanding of myself as present. In fact, phenomenology argues that it is impossible to set yourself aside. To think that you are doing so is a dangerous self-delusion. Now, this suggests that if you imagine that you have been able to mute yourself or remove yourself somehow from the engagement in favour of the other, then you are deluding yourself and potentially becoming even more dangerous than you wanted to be, than you thought you were avoiding being dangerous, but in fact by deluding yourself in this way you run the risk of being even more dangerous. And we'll unpack that a bit as we go along. We can see the phenomenological approach emerging in the relational philosophy of Martin Buber, and I recommend that you do a bit of reading of Martin Buber. It's pretty straightforward to read. In particular, his little book called I and Thou, and that's a philosophical idea that you've probably already encountered in various forms. I recommend that you actually read Buber's work. It can be really enriching of your understanding of human encounters. So we can see this idea of the intersubjective relational phenomenological approach coming out in his philosophy, who in all his levels of relating, the I-it, the I-you, and the I-thou, situates the I as an indispensable element in relation. Whether I am aware of it or not, whether I intend it or not, or whether I resist it or not, the I, the subject, my own subject, is always present, either in healthy or in unhealthy ways. And if I'm not aware of myself and understanding the ways that I am present, then I run the risk of being a damaging presence, not a caring one. There is no interpersonal encounter between pastoral spiritual carer and the recipient of care in which the carer is absent in favour of the recipient of care. The substitutionary stance, therefore, that Pembroke outlines is, from a phenomenological perspective, a dangerous delusion. It is dangerous because the carer who thinks that they have set themselves aside has in fact only become present in a less authentic and less self-aware way. The I is still there in the encounter, but it is there on the basis of a dangerous misunderstanding. If, therefore, the idea of substitution in a caring encounter is not a real thing, but a delusion, we must carefully and clearly reassess what is meant by availability from a phenomenological perspective. And Cooper White says, we cannot separate our subjectivity from any aspect of our knowing, and we know the I enters every equation, no matter how hard we strive to achieve a neutral, observing stance. And I would add to that a substitutionary stance in the way that Pembroke speaks about it. So the same is true for the delusion that I can somehow substitute the desires, emotions, and feelings of the other person for my own. If I tell myself that I can do this, I become dangerously susceptible to being subconsciously driven by my own supposedly absent self. Phenomenology has led the listening professions to consider what has become known as the intersubjective approach to listening encounters. Now, let's just pause here, and I'll just, if you're struggling with what phenomenology is, let me just give you this very, very basic little window into what is quite a complex field of philosophical and psychological inquiry. So, the philosophy of phenomenology, though complex and many-faceted, can be initially accessed through this idea. The idea that one is able to doubt all previously presumed ways of perceiving the world and embrace a directly intuitive perception of reality as it gives itself to us through experience in this very present moment. In other words, check what you presume to be true about something or someone, subject your presumptions to critical doubt, and apply your perception to your immediate lived experience. Now, this is really, really important. What you're being invited by phenomenology to do is pay attention to the current moment, what is happening right now in front of you, and learn how to discern between your own prejudices and preconceptions that might make you interpret something in a particular way, and the actual experiential data that you're receiving in the present moment. And phenomenology simply tries to say, try and take some of your prejudicial filters out of the way so that you get a more immediate, intuitive sense of what is actually happening in front of you. Now, this is a really important idea for pastoral and spiritual care. It is actually a skill to learn how to become aware of your own prejudices and preconceptions and how they might be colouring the way you're interpreting the person who is in front of you. So that's a very, very simplistic but helpful, I think, way of that first step into the phenomenological question about how we know and how we perceive reality and the world around us. And this understanding, phenomenology, has led the listening professions to consider what has become known as the intersubjective approach to listening encounters. It's an approach that is illuminated by Jesus' reference to the second most important commandment, to love your neighbour as yourself, a reference that holds the self to be at the heart of the loving encounter with the other. The idea that the self can be muted or made absent from the encounter is discarded in a phenomenological determination to see what is actually happening and embrace the presence of the self in every encounter as a given reality. I'm going to be present, whether I like it or not. I'm here. That's what an interpersonal encounter is. It needs two minimum subjects. And the best way for me to be present is to be present as a person who is committed to understanding myself. Who am I? How am I present? And how is my presence impacting this encounter? It's a profoundly important skill for us to begin to learn. So instead of substituting the needs of the other for my own drives, emotions, and motivations, I apply myself to the task of actively perceiving and understanding my own drives, emotions, and motivations, and on that basis, establishing an honest and dignified presence with the other in whom I facilitate, create space for the same process. So I inherently in this, I recognise the full dignity of the other. I relate to them as someone who is a full human subject engaging in the interpersonal encounter at the same level as I am. And I do not, therefore, enter that interpersonal encounter under the delusion that somehow I am the skilled helper and they are the needy person. They need me in order to get them to where they want to go. The understanding of the other as inherently dignified subject actually understands that they have the spiritual vitality in themselves to determine meaning and engagement with the world for themselves. And a genuine, common, interpersonal engagement of two common human persons in the full dignity of their own autonomous volition, seeking meaning in the midst of the current experience, is the extraordinary power of human encounter. Now, I know that's a lot to take in. It's fairly dense, which is why I ask you to pause frequently and go back, listen again, read the article, and hopefully, if you're able to, watch the film, because you'll get a really good example of someone actually doing this for themselves, and that is the filmmaker Julia Haslett, who works really, really hard to understand herself and her own drives and compulsions in caring for her brother and for others in her experience who are sufferers. In this way, I am more likely to be truly present with the other as a listening subject. I am less likely to succumb to that most subtle killer of all genuine interpersonal encounter, which is condescension, the kind of sense that I might convey that somehow I am in the superior position of wisdom and wellness, and you are in the inferior position of needing my wisdom and my wellness in order to help you along. This can be just the most insidious and difficult to perceive attitude in ourselves, and yet it is very, very quickly perceived by those for whom we're caring. And Raymond Gator is the one who really helps us unpack what this idea of the condescending, caring presence and how damaging it can be is for us. And I've shared that article with you, so I hope you've read that as well. So I'm more likely to facilitate the mutual dignity that occurs when each subject is enabled to grow and expand in their own autonomous agency. I am not trying to set up a situation in which the person I am seeking to offer care to, paying attention to listen to, needs me or depends on me for their own spiritual vitality. Quite the opposite. Part of what being spiritually healthy means is the capacity to develop in my own autonomous agency, the capacity to learn, grow, discern, make decisions for myself and about myself that construct meaning. That's not to say that I don't relate to others in that process, but I don't relate to others from a position of inferior neediness. I have my own full, dignified human agency in that, and I meet others face to face in a common place. That's why Gator talks about common humanity. That's the spiritual vitality that we are hoping for in those that we encounter in spiritual care. In her outstanding study of the intersubjective approach, Pamela Cooper-White reinterprets the role of transference and countertransference in interpersonal encounter. And this is a quote from the article that you've read. In this understanding, transference and countertransference operate together to form a complex interrelation, referred to by some writers as intersubjectivity, which operates at both conscious and unconscious levels. Self and other become intertwined in this relational matrix. Aspects of both selfness and otherness may be discovered in numerous places. Internally, in one's own thoughts, fantasies and memories. Externally, in relation to the actual other. And in the between of the relationship itself, the interstices of the relationship, or the intersections, the way two subjects intersect, of the relationship as it is continually being co-constructed. So you can hear that there's a lot of dignity in that idea of co-construction of meaning. and it recognises the full presence of two subjects in that encounter. She goes on, this complex relation informs and generates patterns of meaning making, which may be enacted or not enacted, non-verbally, and also affects the quality of the healing, positive or negative, that evolves in the helping relationship over time. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty complex. It's not as simple and black and white as I'm the expert, you're the one who's in trouble, listen to me, I'll get you through, I'll give you a formula or a therapeutic method to help you achieve what you want to achieve. That just sounds so much easier and more simplistic. But phenomenology and the ideas of intersubjectivity strip away the delusion that it is that simple. Human beings simply aren't that simple. We are complex. And in fact, the ways that we relate and the ways that we shape and influence one another are a multitude and complex. And in fact, we never really fully understand, as Raymond Gaita again shares with us, we never really fully grasp the extent to which we affect one another when we encounter each other. We're irreducible to those effects. This is where the film kicks in, really giving us a great visual and narrative example of how a human person can commit themselves to self-understanding in a way that enables them to enter into an interpersonal encounter, a caring encounter, with a level of self-understanding that will enable them to be helpful, not harmful. Some of the questions that filmmaker Julia Haslett begins with are outstanding questions, and they're questions really that come directly from Simone Weil, who is the subject of the exploration of the film. The secondary subject, the real subject of the film, is the filmmaker herself, but we'll go into that shortly. Listen to some of these questions. These are actually taken straight from the article, the Cooper White article, but they're questions that are implicit in the film and in the work of Simone Weil as well. How do we ever really know a person? Are we truly able to enter into that experience? How do we know that what we have experienced is a true representation of the other's experience, as opposed to something we've imagined or projected from our own experience? How do we know that what we have come to know will help us to be helpful to the other person? How will that help us decide what to do or to say in the next moment? We cannot separate our subjectivity from any aspect of our knowing, and we know the I enters every equation, no matter how hard we strive to achieve a neutral observing stance. So this is Cooper White's way of getting into the phenomenological ideas that were thought so deeply about by Simone Weil and others. Julia Haslett, the filmmaker, has provided us with an outstanding example of the difficult process of deconstructing the tendency to substitute someone else's needs for one's own and applying oneself to the task of a phenomenological examination of what it really means to pay attention to the suffering other. The film that I'm inviting you to watch is an attempt by Haslett to genuinely understand herself and her inner drive to pay attention to suffering. To help her gain a greater understanding of herself, Haslett turns to French philosopher Simone Weil. The film, An Encounter with Simone Weil, is really about the filmmaker herself. When Haslett was 16, her father committed suicide. Ever since, Haslett and her brother have lived with their own struggles. Haslett's brother Timothy struggles moment by moment with a deep anxiety and depression. Haslett herself is driven by a deep compulsion to vigilance around those who are suffering. Her father's suicide, she says, has instilled in her a deep drive to pay attention. She feels that if she doesn't pay attention, someone might die. Now, that's a really powerful and vulnerable observation that she's made about herself. That she lives moment by moment with this sense that she is responsible to pay attention to the suffering others in order to prevent them from dying. What an extraordinary driver. But even more extraordinary that she has become aware of it and is prepared to apply herself to understanding it. Her incredibly generous self-disclosure in this film gives us a glimpse of her almost desperate search for a deeper understanding of what it means to pay attention. For her, it is a very real and deeply personal search. Her brother Timothy is gripped by a crippling anxiety and she fears for his life. Hazlitt's search for understanding in the life and work of Simone Weil reveals Weil's courageous and flawed attempt to understand the suffering of her times and her own drive to understand and participate in the process of ethical response. Hazlitt's search for the real Simone Weil emerges actually as a search for an answer to her own questions, Hazlitt's questions. What does it mean for me to pay attention to the suffering of another person? Implied in that question is the deeper drive that has shaped her life since the suicide of her father. The deeper drive is a need to save people from dying. Somehow she has taken into herself a compulsion to save people. It is a compulsion that is driving her behaviour, and in fact it's driving her creative life. And at the same time, it is putting her and others in jeopardy. She runs the risk of harming herself and those whom she so desperately wants to save, in this instance, primarily her brother. There is a moment in this film that I really want you to consider at some depth. We can talk about this further when we meet for our tutorial. With extraordinary vulnerability, Hazlitt films herself attempting to care for her brother Timothy, whose anxiety is worsening by the day. The scene reveals the physical distress in Julia as she tries to come to grips with her own powerlessness in the face of Timothy's suffering. She names it for what it is, and in doing so reveals her struggle to understand herself as someone who wants to care for and to save her brother from his suffering. She says this: "So often I stand there feeling powerless to relieve Timothy of his distress, and then offer what seems to be a useless piece of advice. If I can't do anything to help him, then it seems like all I can do is be unhappy alongside him. Anything else would feel like a betrayal." I encourage you to pause at this moment in the film and watch it a couple of times. Really enter into the distress not only of Timothy but of Julia, who is desperately trying to be present to her brother in a way that saves him. By the time the film is being edited, Timothy has taken his own life. In a world emptied of content for Julia, because of the death of Timothy, she asks the question that forms the basis for our own contemplation of the art of listening deeply to another. This is a question that I think we all need to ask as we begin to shape the skills of paying attention to ourselves as being present to the other, available to the other. She wonders this: all I can do is wonder if it was more attention he needed and less advice. Julia feels deeply the words of Simone Weil at this time. Weil says, "The capacity to give one's attention to a sufferer is a very rare and difficult thing. It is almost a miracle. It is a miracle," says Weil. What's highlighted here, really, really importantly for us, is that the giving of advice to someone who is deeply distressed cannot be equated with paying attention to them. the giving of advice, the filling of the space between us with our own wisdom, with our own therapeutic ideas, is in fact not deep listening. It is not spiritual care. We may have all kinds of ideas about how the other person will be healed, could be healed. We need to check those and create space for the other person to do their own spiritual work, to respect their dignity, to uphold their dignity, and to meet them as equals, as two dignified human subjects meeting in a space of common humanity as we co-construct meaning, not as we try and fix everything or as we try and protect ourselves from the reality of what's going on with stories and hopes and narratives that are not real. We are here to be deeply open and dignified with one another. It is a profound call and a complex and difficult skill to develop in ourselves. And I insist on calling it a skill because it can be learnt. It is not something that is at the foundational vocational level. It is in fact a skill that grows directly out of a sense of vocation, but it is something that we must develop and work on and continue to hone into a craft or an art and a skill through our own contemplative and mindful practice, through supervision, through spiritual direction, and through the methods of praxis, action and reflection. So this is a profound moment, just to get back to the film. This is a profound moment in the film that I really want you to focus on and pay attention to. Because it's at this moment in the film that we feel Julia coming close to the understanding that is key to the art of spiritual care. Julia must confront the drive to save others in herself and acknowledge that she is unable to do so, and that in fact she is not responsible to save others from their suffering. That in fact most people don't want to be saved. They want to be walked with as they work it out themselves. She's beginning to understand, Julia, beginning to understand in the film, that to genuinely pay attention to the suffering other, we must show them the dignity of giving them the space to construct meaning in response to their own suffering. Julia begins to feel the fine distinction between condescension, the failure to pay attention, the giving of advice in this instance, and genuine compassion, the dignity of common humanity in the midst of suffering. Therefore, in pastoral and spiritual care, we do not substitute someone else's suffering for our own. Rather, we seek as autonomous subjects to participate in, pay attention to, the circumstances of the suffering other, in order to understand and recognise the dignity of the suffering other as they construct meaning and determine their own spiritual response. We do not seek to save others from suffering. We seek to participate in the context of suffering and to make our own struggle one of common humanity with the sufferer. And that's the root meaning of compassion, to suffer with. Not to suffer on behalf of, not to remove the suffering, but to enter into an interpersonal, intersubjective encounter with another on the basis of common, dignified humanity, and to work together to co-construct meaning. And if it is possible, to work together to undermine the structures that are causing suffering and to bring about structures that bring human flourishing into being. For it's when we participate in the dignity of the suffering other by seeing their humanity that we reveal their humanity to others. That's Raymond Gator. We do no one any service by seeking to take their suffering upon ourselves at the expense of our own experience. To do so is actually an assault on their dignity and on our own dignity. It is an attempt to save them from the reality of their own experience by setting up an illusory alternative reality in which we become their saviour. The only salvation available to any of us in the midst of suffering is that which we discover through genuine common humanity, through paying attention to one another in genuine and dignified love. As people of faith, we must pay careful attention to these fine distinctions of understanding. Many of our faith narratives actually shape us in the dangerous art of substitution, as Pembroke demonstrates. But substitution is in fact a form of escape from reality and therefore deeply misguided. And Kenneth Leach, a wonderful spiritual director, Anglican bishop, now deceased, wrote this about this kind of risk in our faith narratives. He wrote, "One of the contributions of psychology to spiritual guidance is to throw light on the pathological features within religious life and to enable true spirituality to be distinguished from distorted forms. When does religion assume pathological forms?" he asks. The simple answer is when it ceases to be a means of integration of the personality and becomes a form of escape from being human. Given all of this, what can we say that we have identified as the skills of listening that we need to form in ourselves in this first lecture on listening skills? Well, firstly, as I said at the beginning, following the example of Julia Haslet, the first listening skill is that of paying attention to oneself. Ask yourself, in supervision, spiritual direction, therapy, and prayer, what are the inner drives that shape my compulsions in listening encounters? And we've talked about the example in Julia Haslet's life, her compulsion to save others through paying attention to them. So that is a skill. Pay attention to oneself. Secondly, the second skill that we need to form in ourselves is the stance of common humanity. This is the stance in which I give the other person space in which to construct meaning for themselves, and I participate in that space, but I do not dominate that space. I don't fill that space with myself. The space is there for the other in intersection with me to construct their own meaning. And I need to recognise that my presence, my genuine listening presence, will have an impact on the way that they construct meaning. There's that co-construction of meaning thing that Pamela Cooper White talks about again. So this is the stance of common humanity. It is the place in which we uphold the dignity of the other, and by doing so, we uphold our own dignity. So, paying attention to oneself, fostering a stance of common humanity, and the third listening skill that we learn primarily from the story of Simone Weil is the skill of proximity. This skill is a radical commitment to the real nature of things, and this is where we finished. It is a refusal to pretend that all will be well. It is a phenomenological receiving of the reality of the suffering of the other as it is given to us in this present moment, and a recognition that we share the reality of suffering as an aspect of our common humanity. And if we share in the suffering, we may also share in the quest for understanding it that will mitigate its power in our lives. Now, I'm the first to admit that here are some pretty solid philosophical and theological ideas and psychological ideas that will need your careful attention and hard work. But I don't shy away from that, nor should you. I encourage you to reflect on this. If you need to watch the lecture or listen to the lecture more than once, do so. If you don't understand something, write it down as a question and bring it to our conversation later in the week on Thursday, 11:30 on Blackboard Collaborate. Don't let questions hide away in darkness. Bring them out into the light. If you're asking it, there's pretty good chance that someone else has thought of the same question and will be very relieved that you're asking it. So don't be shy. Ask your questions, bring your comments, your critical reflections. In particular, how some of these ideas might challenge things that you have and perhaps continue to assume or presume to be true about the way you approach interpersonal encounters. This is where we begin the learning and the crafting of these skills that will become our lifelong companions in the vocation of listening deeply to others and constructing together with them meaning in the midst of the reality of our existence together. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.